Okay, so let's talk about shifts in the demand curve. So you can see here we have a typical demand curve represented by a downward sloping line, which effectively means that as the quantity of a good effectively increases in price, so as the price is increasing, the quantity demanded is going to decrease. Hence the fact that price and quantity on a demand curve are inversely related. That is to say that as the price increases of a good, the quantity demanded is going to decrease of the good. Okay, so now that we kind of have our basic demand curve, let's talk about what shifts a demand curve. And to do that, there are 5 main things that shift a demand curve. So the first one is the number of buyers in a market. And so what do I mean by the number of buyers in a market? So effectively, the number of consumers in a market can cause the demand curve to shift. So that's the first thing that can cause a shift in the demand curve. The second thing that can cause a shift in the demand curve is the income. And this is effectively income of the consumers in the market. So if their income increases or if their income decreases, that would shift the demand curve. The third thing that can shift the demand curve is the price of related goods. And so what do we mean by related goods? So we mean either substitute goods, or complementary goods. So goods that are either a substitute or a complement for the good. So for example, a substitute would be a good that you could consume instead of the other good. So in that case, it could be potentially a substitute would be consuming, rather than consuming lemons, you could consume limes. Those would be a substitute. A complement would be a good that you would consume with another good. So let's say milk and coffee. Those two goods are goods that you would consume together. So the fourth thing that can cause a shift in the demand curve are tastes, and specifically consumer tastes and preferences. So if consumers who are represented here by the demand curve, if they're, for some reason, something shifts in their tastes, that's going to shift the demand curve. The fifth item is expectations. And expectations are effectively what consumers think are going to happen in the market. And so that can also shift the demand curve. Okay, so now that we kind of went through some of the basic items for shifts in the demand curve, why don't we walk through an example or two for what a shift in the demand curve actually looks like. So in this case, let's first start with something like this. So why don't we say what happens in the market for orange juice if it is found to lead to weight loss? Okay, so what's going to happen in this market? So what happens in the market for orange juice if it is found to lead to weight loss? So the first thing you can kind of clue in here is that it's going to change consumer tastes. So this is going to immediately impact tastes. So consumer tastes, number 4, is going to be what is causing the shift in demand. And so let's say initially that this is going to be our demand curve. So we have something like this, and we are also going to have the demand, and let's say this is our equilibrium point. And why don't we also draw a supply curve so we can really clearly see what exactly is happening here. So this is going to be our demand curve and our supply curve. Okay, and this is our equilibrium point right here initially. So what happens in this market for orange juice if it's found to lead to weight loss? So first off, we know it's going to shift because of a change in consumer tastes and preferences. It's going to shift the demand curve and it's going to shift the demand curve up. And it's going to shift the demand curve up because consumers are going to demand more orange juice because it is found to lead to weight loss. So because of that, let's draw our new demand curve right here. So this is going to be our D prime curve, also known as our new demand curve. And this dot right here is effectively going to be the new equilibrium point. So this was our old equilibrium point, so I'll number this as 1, and this is our new equilibrium point. So I'm going to number that as 2. So as you can see here, the increase in demand is going to cause an increase in price. So price moves from this point to this point, and quantity increases. It increases from this point to this point. So effectively, what's happening when the shift in the demand curve happens is that the demand curve is shifting outwards. And it's shifting outwards because consumers want more orange juice because it's found to lead to weight loss. And so because of that, there's going to be an increase in the price and an increase in the quantity demanded of orange juice. Okay, so now let's talk about shifts in the supply curve. So the supply curve is effectively an upward sloping line. And it's upward sloping because as the price increases, so as we move up, the quantity supplied is also going to increase, which makes sense. As the price increases, that means more producers, aka suppliers, are going to want to increase their production of the good. Okay, so now that we have the supply curve down, why don't we talk about things that cause shifts in the supply curve? So there are 4 important things that cause shifts in the supply curve. And what are those? So first, a change in the input price causes a shift in the supply curve. So an input price is anything that will cause a movement effectively in the supply curve. Or sorry, I should say a shift, cause a shift in the supply curve. And so because of that, input prices are effectively anything that goes into the good. So let's say in this case, glass for cars or steel for cars. Those are both examples of inputs. And when those prices change, that affects the supply curve. The second thing is technology. So if there's a change in technology, that's going to affect the supply curve. And specifically because the production of the good will most likely become more efficient. And so because of that, the supply curve will shift. The third item is the number of sellers in a market, which makes sense. If there are more people producing the good or less people producing the good, the supply curve most likely is going to shift. Finally, number 4, expectations. So expectations are effectively similar to the expectations of consumers. If sellers have expectations, those expectations can cause changes and shifts in the supply curve. So because of that, we need to be careful when we are looking at the supply curve, and we need to make sure that we understand that the expectations of producers can cause shifts in the supply curve. Okay, so now that we've went over the 4 basic causes for shifts in the supply curve, why don't we go over an example and see what that looks like? Okay, so let's say that in this case, what happens to the t-shirt market if a new machine can make t-shirts 4 times faster? So once again, what happens to the t-shirt market if a new machine can make t-shirts 4 times faster? Okay, so let's take a look at that. So first off, it's important to recognize which one of these that effectively is referring to. And so, yes, it is referring to technology. So the technology in the t-shirt market is effectively increasing. And so because of that, we can say that there's going to be a shift in the supply curve. And so now, when you think about what happens in the market for t-shirts, if there is an increase in technology, and specifically if a new machine can make t-shirts 4 times faster, what do we think that's going to do to quantity? Well, we can definitively say that that is going to increase the quantity produced because you can produce t-shirts 4 times faster. So that's going to cause a shift in the supply curve, and that shift is going to be rightward. So effectively, this is going to be the new supply curve. So we're moving from this point, effectively this supply curve, to this supply curve. But now let's make it a little bit more realistic. Normally we have demand. So let's add our demand curve to see what that's going to do to price and quantity. So this is our demand curve. Okay, so this is our initial equilibrium point. Let's call that point 1. So there's our equilibrium. So because of the increase in technology and the ability of producers to make a good more efficiently, we're now going to move down to this point, point 2. So what happens here is that, as you can see, price decreases, but quantity increases. So that's really important here. So there is a larger quantity of t-shirts being produced in this new market where there's a new machine, but because of that, the price of t-shirts is actually decreasing. And so because of that, we're effectively having a situation where there is more of the good at a lower price. So that's kind of a good